one of the most liberating things about tech was the openness to failure. And there are so many things wrong with Silicon Valley, right? But when I travel the world and I like am in so many budding tech spaces, whether we talk about Paris, London, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Sydney, Melbourne, right? Everybody kind of wants to recreate the Silicon Valley model, and they think it has to do with funding or access to compute, but actually it's not. There is a failure mindset in Silicon Valley, like a growth mindset, which was to me incredibly liberating. Like it is actually fine if you try something and fall flat on your face, as long as you come out of it having learned something. So that's the key part of it. It's not just like fail, it's okay, but it's like fail and then grow as a person, because you're going to look back and say, oh, I should have done this, and this differently.
Welcome to Anchor Change, where we help you panic responsibly in a chaotic world. I'm Katie Harbath. I've navigated impossible trade-offs in tech, politics, and my personal life for decades. I know that can be lonely. As a Midwesterner who spent 20 years in Silicon Valley and DC, it's taken me a while to figure it out. I still am. One thing that helps me is hearing the stories of other people forging their own paths. Because in a world of complexity, you don't have to navigate it alone. Welcome to Anchor Change. Hi, friends, and welcome back to Anchor Change. I'm Katie Harbath. This week's episode is for anyone who's ever felt overwhelmed by the pace of AI or unsure what power they really hold to shape the future. I wanted to have Rumman Chowdhury on because she is a trailblazer in the responsible AI space. She's worked in big tech, she's launched her own nonprofit, she's advised the Biden administration, and now she runs Humane Intelligence. And what stands her apart isn't just her resume, but it's her refusal to settle for cynicism. She calls herself an AI optimist, and not in a naive way. I love this conversation we have. She knows the risks. She's lived them, but she still believes that we have agency and that our choices, what tools we use, what questions we ask, and what we say no to actually matters. And that optimism in this moment is in itself a radical act. We talk about how to embrace failure, how to test and red team the technologies that are shaping our world, and why the right to repair isn't just about tractors. You'll hear the story in the interview. It's about power, access, and dignity in the digital age. I hope you enjoy. Well, Rumman, welcome to Anchor Change.
Thank you so much for having me, Katie. Happy to be here.
So I want to kick off. I was watching your South by Southwest talk, and you talk about being an AI optimist, of which I also like to consider myself an optimist. But many people are sometimes surprised by that, with given everything that's happening in the world today. And there's a lot of fear and skepticism that's kind of dominating the conversation. What fuels that optimism for you? And has it ever been hard to hold on to?
I'll answer the second one first. I think it is hard to hold on to, right? Especially for somebody who pays attention to what's happening, and there are some very clear problems and flaws. And also, I want to take a minute to define the term optimist. I think people may conflate it with something like naivete or lack of understanding. And I actually think it's the opposite. I think it is truly like, that meme when it ends up in the galaxy brain. Your
Yeah.
galaxy brain moment is when you choose to be an optimist, even knowing all of the flaws and problems that exist. Right. So, being an optimist in the space, I actually think is almost like the most enlightened form, because what you're saying is, I fully recognize and understand the problems in this space. However, I am choosing to be an optimist because in being an optimist, you are making a commitment to have your work, what you do, contribute to the good. So one cannot simply be an optimist by being an armchair observer within tech of all the bad things like that's how you end up a pessimist, right? When you have a role or a job or a position where you consciously or subconsciously know that you're not contributing to making things better, but you're observing all the bad things happening. And I think it actually comes from a place of guilt. One is actually opened to be an optimist when you have actively decided that your life and your life's work, and it doesn't have to be, making your own nonprofit or being a whistleblower. It could be something smaller. It could be being in a corporation, but also advocating or working in like trust and safety teams, or, advocating for good in another capacity, right? Being an engineer who says, hey, we should do bias and discrimination checks, even though it is not popular or trendy to be talking about bias and discrimination right now, right? Those people can choose to be optimists, because you are saying that within, like, I am making active choices in my role, in my capacity as somebody who engages in tech and with tech to do the right thing and to do the good thing. Because once you do things like that, you realize that actually everybody can do it in some way, right? You can choose to not download that app, right? You can choose to not be on X. There are many things one can choose to do. And that's what makes me an optimist. in this space, right? It is knowing that I have choice and I can choose to do good.
I love that, and I try to remind people all the time that we all have agency still.
Hmm. Hmm.
We all have agency, like you said, in terms of what apps we choose to download, what we choose to engage with on social media. We can make those choices of what's best for us, and I really love how you describe that because I think that that's a lot of folks that are listening as well as myself, what are even if it's just small things every single day that you can be doing to contribute to the greater good.
I'll tell you like one kind of stupid one that I do that actually does make me feel better, and it not just makes me feel better, but it's like every action you take. Like if we think about data collection, right? Data collection goes both ways in the sense that every action I take is a signal to the company because I know they're tracking it, they're all picking it up, right? So one small one that I think everybody should do is use two-factor authentication for everything, right? And another one is when the cookies settings pop up, click choose my cookies and go and pick them, right? And everyone's like, oh, it's so annoying. Well, if you can't do that 15 seconds of work to do 2FA to ensure that your accounts are protected, which contributes and, like, again, sends a signal that people are actually concerned about security, or if you can't bother to click that little button that says reject cookies and then and I know they make it hard for you, still do it. Do it. It takes you 15 seconds. And what you have done is then not contributed to, and again, you've sent a signal to the company that people care. Because remember, for many, many years, all the CEOs touted the quote unquote privacy paradox, where everybody spoke about wanting privacy, but nobody ever took action to do it. So take that action. You actually do, and it's not the best. I get it. Like it's not perfect. It's not going to fix all of data privacy in one go. But to the extent that you have agency, as you've mentioned, and I love the word agency, right? That is like the big thing. That is what keeps me an optimist, is knowing that like we still have some modicum of agency. Fight for it, keep it. Use the tools. Use whatever little tools are given to you to have agency.
And that leads me somewhat into the next question, because in your talk, you also talked about how much we learn the most from failure. And I've been a huge believer of that throughout my career. But we live in a society that fears it hides it penalizes it. In today's age with I think a lot of people are scared of doing the wrong thing, even though they can't necessarily define what the wrong thing might be.
Right.
How have you learned to navigate failure and what helps you move through it when it happens?
I don't know. I guess I'm just not like put off by it a lot. Like, who cares? It actually is quite liberating. So just as an explainer of like how I got here, right? So I started my career in public policy and nonprofits, right? And then I went from there to academia. And those are all like incredibly rigid environments, right? Like the nonprofit space and especially like big nonprofits, right? Very, very hierarchical. Public policy is a very hierarchical place. One does not speak out of turn. One does not like, if you are like young and have a bunch of ideas, that's nice. Nobody listens to you, right? Because you have not quote unquote earned your space or done your time or whatever. And and I'm pointing out the bad, but I'm pointing out the parts that can be very stifling to people, right? And in that environment where it's quite punitive, right? It's not, you don't have the freedom to fail because everybody's watching. And the minute you do something wrong, it's like you did this one little thing wrong, therefore you're disqualified from the entire class of things, right? And academia is just like that as well, right? It's and a lot of it, most of it's actually born out of the incentive model in these places, which are not structured very well at all. One of the most liberating things about tech was the openness to failure. And there are so many things wrong with Silicon Valley, right? But when I travel the world and I like am in so many budding tech spaces, whether we talk about Paris, London, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Sydney, Melbourne, right? Everybody kind of wants to recreate the Silicon Valley model and they think it has to do with funding or access to compute, but actually it's not. There is a failure mindset in Silicon Valley, like a growth mindset, which was to me incredibly liberating. Like it is actually fine if you try something and fall flat on your face, as long as you come out of it having learned something. So that's the key part of it. It's not just like fail, it's okay, but it's like fail and then grow as a person because you're going to look back and say, oh, I should have done this, and this differently. I will say, like, on the other extreme, a lot of the tech failing upwards comes from people, mainly white men, who are allowed to fail to the tunes of billions of dollars at the expense of all of us and not have any repercussions. And it's not even repercussions we look for. It actually is growth. There is no perception of growth. They don't learn. They don't say, hey, maybe next time I just won't like exploit my users. Wouldn't that be a breath of fresh air?
Minus despite Mark Zuckerberg being like, "Oh, I learned to not care about politics anymore," or like, "I'm not gonna
Yeah, he
apologize
has the
anymore." Like, that's not
privilege to not care about
Yeah.
politics because he's not stuck in a war zone. Like, man, like, it's not his family people in the current administration want to deport, and it's not his relatives who may lose their citizenship. So he has the immense privilege to do that. And like, honestly, like, that's fine. I wouldn't flaunt it. There's many privileges I have as an individual as well, right? And some of it is the ability to have the freedom to like sit on this podcast and talk really candidly with you, right? There are many people who are in situations in tech right now where they don't have the ability to have this candor. And they feel these feelings and they think these things, but they cannot say these things because of the punitive environment that exists in tech right now. And I recognize that's a privilege I have, right? But I'm not going to sit here and say, well, everybody at a tech company should be speaking up or whistleblowing or whatever, because it has very clear, very serious repercussions. But there are little things one can do, again, in the confines of like protecting yourself, protecting your family, protecting your mental health and well being, but also trying to contribute to doing good.
Well, and that's something I always try to remind people is that we oftentimes think of these companies as these behemoths, right? That have those leaders that have some of that immense privilege. But there are so many people working within the companies that are trying to do that incremental change every single day within the confines of what they're given inside that company. And that work continues
Yeah.
even if the current environment is not conclusive to talking about it as much
Right,
as it
right. And
is.
and those people never go away, right? And like the
Yeah.
thing is, it is kind of frustrating because as a like I think one of the worst things to come out of this increasingly polarized environment is like one has to either pick absolute good or otherwise it's absolute evil. And there is no such thing as absolute good. And there's also really very few cases of absolute evil. Like all of these human beings have some weird redeeming quality. Like I truly, it is on the record, I don't like Elon Musk, like shock of the century. I have met so many people who say that like he is an incredibly insightful and brilliant human. I'm like, I truly don't care. But that being said, like recognizing this dichotomy that every person is capable of having, thoughtful, let's say, conversations. Or I would say, like, yeah, Elon Musk is really great at identifying technologies that are going to be that are quite future thinking, but then acquiring the companies, not necessarily doing the work himself, right? But his character flaws are massive and contribute to a lot of bad. But I would say if I were to be asked like what is a good quality that this person has, I'm like, he's actually very capable of taking a technology that sounds nonsensical, like satellites in space and electric vehicles, and making them happen. And I can admit that, even though I can also say in the same breath that I think is a horrible human being, right? Like people are complicated, companies are
Both things can
complicated.
be true.
Both
You
things
can
are
hold both.
often
Yeah.
true. Exactly. Both things are true actually about just about everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of one of my goals for this season is talking about the pivots that people are making because a lot of people are either have been laid off, they are thinking about their careers, they're recognizing that the world is changing quite a bit. And you've made a couple of fascinating pivots. You've been a data scientist, a product leader, a founder. What's your internal process for deciding when it's time to pivot, how you do those evolutions? Do you think about it or does it just kind of happen? I'm just curious of like how that's sort of evolved over your career.
Yeah, I guess it's funny because like all what you said is completely true, but to me, I have always been internally consistent. Like I've always done the same thing. And what that thing is, I like you understanding using data to understand human behavior, right? That is just what I do. It's what I did as a social scientist. It's what I did in my PhD program in political science, what I did as a data scientist. Responsible AI was like another version of that, right? Where I recognized that just building products in data science was actually not fully capturing what it meant to understand human behavior and human preferences. And it was more interesting to me to understand the edge cases. And then from there, really everything I've done has always kind of been the same thing, right? So now, for example, humane intelligence, we're building the community of algorithmic assessors. Why? Well, because I think more people need to understand how to utilize data to create better products and services for people. Because again, going back to being an AI optimist, and truly, if I was an AI pessimist, I would be out there chaining myself to a data center right now, right? Like I would not work in tech. Like I would not be here, or I would be on some other extreme. But I think all of us, the reason we're not on that extreme is we know that there is good possible, right? We know that we can and should be able to envision and build this better world. So what can you contribute to building that, right? So all of it's kind of been towards the same thing, whether it was a startup, whether it was working at Accenture, was working at Twitter or Humane Intelligence, all of it has always been towards how can we understand how to use this technology or whatever this is to A, gather information about human behavior and preferences, and then B, go build the things that people are saying they want.
So tell me a little bit more about Humane Intelligence, one of your current projects, and what it is that you all are working on. And I'm also kind of curious how maybe that mission has also shifted as the technology has been shifting over the last couple of years.
Yeah, so Humane Intelligence, so the original origin of Humane Intelligence actually came from Twitter. And at Twitter, we did something called an algorithmic bias bounty. And I think it was the first time a major tech company had opened up their code for specifically this kind of evaluation. When I say this kind of evaluation, it was evaluating a model that we were using for image cropping for different kinds of biases. What I recognized is that my team, I was the engineering director of the machine learning ethics, transparency, and accountability team. If you're familiar with the structure of Twitter, we were located within the team called Cortex, and Cortex was like the core ML AI services team for the rest of the company. So my counterparts were all engineering directors. They did things like build ML pipelines, that kind of thing. So we were a hybrid research and engineering team, and that's actually important because again, my focus was not on research per se; it was on improving product, which is where I like to be. Anyway, so we do this algorithmic bias bounding because I recognize that the potential for bias and risk space. And now we talk about it quite a bit with like generative AI models or general purpose AI models, but it's quite broad. And my team, no matter how diverse I try to make them, right, no matter how big our scope is, could never capture the full complexities and biases that exist in the world. And the best people to do it are not, the people who are the 1% of the 1% who could go work at a tech company. It's the people who have that lived experience. So we open up, our code at that time. Really, the only way you could engage with an algorithm is if you were a programmer. And we paid people to find problems. And it was so interesting to see how the media reported on it because it was such a foreign concept that most of the headlines said something like, hackers find flaw in Twitter model. And I'm kind of like, yeah, because we asked them to,
Yeah, that's the
right?
point.
That was the point, right? Like, it's like, thank you and I'm sorry, which is like my favorite Twitter phrase is like, thank you, I'm sorry. Um, yeah, and so that kind of started this ball rolling, right? We got a lot of questions like, can we do this again? Humane Intelligence Incorporated as a nonprofit under a different name originally. We were just going to do these bias bounty type programs, and then I got fired from Twitter, fall of 2022, and then literally in that same month is when ChatGPT launched. So we entered this new era of everybody having an AI model in their hands, and then what I realized is like, oh, this is such an amazing opportunity to get real people's input on how these models work, right? So there's always been a rich history of, user experience research, focus groups, right? Like user testing, but specifically the way we use test and evaluation or red teaming with Humane Intelligence is we go straight to people and we just ask them, interact with this model, find specific issues and give us feedback. And we don't go to them because they're AI experts. We go to them because they have a certain lived experience. They're teachers, they're scientists, they're architects, right? And it's all part of like a more efficient and better way of understanding human preferences. Back to that like internal consistency thing.
No, that makes sense. How do you, from a practical standpoint, for folks that might be listening that aren't as necessarily technical or just learning about AI, what does that look like? Are you having people just go in and test the models and report to you? Are you doing those sort of focus groups? Are you doing red teaming exercises, all of the above?
Yeah, so it's also helpful to know my educational background. So I'm a quantitative and qualitative social scientist. What that means is my background is in test and evaluation and experimental design. So anybody listening to your podcast who knows what those words mean knows that actually there's a very rich history in social sciences of, whether it is survey analysis, right, or different ways of outreach to people, and then quantitatively evaluating that output. So the thing that actually drew me to data science was realizing that data science was actually the same thing that I did as a quantitative social science. So we would ask questions like, why did people vote the way they voted in the last election? And we could look at things like level of education, income, geography, like a million different variables. And we math the math, and then we come out with what variables are important. Why is that interesting? Well, from a data science perspective, what I realized is like, oh, I don't just have to take that analysis and sit on it. I can take that analysis and say, okay, well, if I'm making a product and then I know what preferences are driving people's choices, I then improve the thing based on the variables that I know are impactful. Like I have the empirical evidence. And red teaming is actually quite similar. So there's a lot of time that we actually spent in the experimental design and construct. So there's an entire world that the computer science world has just discovered this year of test and evaluation, metrology, validity, robustness. And they're all using these words, but they have no idea what they mean. Like these are actual words with meaning. So things like when I test a model, I spend a long time thinking about what is the definition of like a qualitative thing that I figure out how to empirically measure. And again, like we actually know that social science has been this for a long time because we have things like a democracy index, a corruption index. Like, how do you measure democracy? Democracy is not,
Right.
but people spend a lot of time to empirically evaluate democratic institutions because we need to do that kind of thing. It is very important because otherwise we only have anecdotes, right? So if I say, oh, like the US as a democracy is failing, and you're like, no, the US as a democracy is doing great, unless we have agreed upon measurements, right? Of what that means, we're just going to argue. We're not going to get anywhere. So for me to convince you, let's say, not that I think you think this, but like, let's say you had that opinion. If I wanted to get you to come to my cause and help me improve things, we need to be able to figure out how to measure it. The same thing with these models. If we're going to say something like these models are perpetuating bias and discrimination, or a lot of the work we get asked to do now is people are going to become over reliant on these models and stop thinking. There's the anecdotal evidence, and qualitative research is incredibly important to help you figure out what to test. But then you have to go and test it. Are people becoming dumber? Are people becoming over reliant? Are they just not thinking anymore? I don't know until you go out and measure it. And then importantly, if I'm going to design an intervention to improve how the model is working, how do I know if it worked? Because again, then you have to have the same sort of measurement. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how to set these things up. The second part is just recruiting the right people with the expertise to evaluate, teaching them how to evaluate, because most of these people are unfamiliar with AI models, and our relationship with tech is quite broken, right? Where the average person thinks that tech people are smarter than them and they're better than them. And who am I to question? We spend a lot of time demystifying and breaking down
Yeah.
that myth. And then we put them to testing. And it's fascinating what we learn.
And I really like also, I was listening to while I was doing my research, some of your other podcasts and speaking and all that. And part of this, as you were talking about that, is like the end game is not necessarily clear, right? About where this is all going, what it will look like. And you've talking a lot about, we might have aspirational goals of what this might go to, but it's oftentimes they may not be measurable outcomes that can guide the work. How do you guide people in that and help them to kind of think about that when we don't have a super clear, here's the finish line we're going towards and trying to build towards, and helping them to think through what that looks like?
Yeah. Part of me even wonders if we will ever have a collective understanding of what good looks like. I
I
think
don't think we will. I don't know
no.
if we ever have.
Right, and I fully agree with you. I think one of the things that frustrates maybe like more traditional engineers when they start to come into the space is they're like, okay, well, what do you want to build? And the answer is not very obvious sometimes, and then they get really frustrated. But I think, one of my subfields in my PhD program is political philosophy. And, the purpose of philosophy, I think, is to teach you how to think, teach you how to ask questions. And one of the most important things in philosophy is actually that it's not meant to give you a clear resolution. It is meant to teach you evaluation. So it's not that like, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, race towards the light. It's more that, okay, like assess where you are and where you want things to be. And then in some period of time, assess whether or not you have made progress towards that. And where you want to be does not have to be this like big grandiose world of a fully equitable world where every child is fed at school. I mean, that is the world we should always be aiming for, but that's not accomplishable in 6 months or 1 year or maybe even a decade or more, right? But we can set smaller goals. So just to like put that in context, I gave a TED talk last year where I talk about having a right to repair. And in that talk, I say we actually have no idea what that looks like. And will fully say I have no idea what that looks like, right? But we can lay the building blocks. For me, step one in the building blocks is demystifying people's or like breaking down that bad relationship that people have with tech where they think that they're not allowed to question technology. The second is enabling critical thinking. And then the third part is creating the institutions by which people are able to hold tech companies accountable. Now, those sound like really digestible things, right? But all that will ultimately lead towards something like a right to repair, which sounds like this crazy cockamamie scheme, but we just don't have the milestones.
Can you explain what right to repair is for those that may not understand it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the right to repair actually has a very long history, and I'm let's say expanding the term a bit, right? So the right to repair actually mostly relates to like physical devices, and things like iPhones. The most anybody who follows this community knows that like the most visible example are actually McDonald's soft serve machines. It's actually true. Like it is deeply fascinating to
I
follow
had
the
no
history of
idea.
yes, it is very interesting to follow the history of McDonald's soft serve machines and the right to repair. So basically, in let's say our parents' time and when most of us were children, you bought a thing like a stereo or a car and you could just like twiddle with it, right? And these were fully mechanical devices. So if something broke, you could, let's say, pop the hood in your car and go and, I don't know, change a carburetor. We're like reaching my upper limit of cars, right? I mean, you could like do a thing. It's physically possible. Like, so, if you like owned a motorbike, and actually people who have motorcycles, it's like one of the few like fully mechanical vehicles that still exist. You can actually just like twiddle with your, and there's an entire community of people who do that. And we've lost that. We've lost that because let's say you look at your iPhone, you have no legal right, or you don't have a legal right to do things to your iPhone, like open it up and twiddle with it and change things. Because once you do, you've like violated your warranty. And not that Apple's going to come after you and like sue you or whatever, but let's say your iPhone breaks and you want to take it to the Apple store, what they'll say is like, well, you did stuff to it, so not our problem, and we're not going to really help you. The thing with the soft serve machines is that people were complaining that they were always broken, and one of the reasons they were always broken is that McDonald's did not let stores fix them themselves, and you had to go through McDonald's corporate, which is like this long, drawn out, very inefficient process. So a soft serve machine could be broken for 6 months or more, even though some of these were like simple mechanical fixes and people could fix them. So the thing is, for certain professions especially, it was a detriment. The most famous example in AI of the right to repair actually comes from farmers. And I find this story like super inspirational because it is just such a clear example of like the world I want to see. So John Deere, major tractor company, right? They introduced like and basically just about every vehicle is basically half computer at this point. Like your car is like 90% a computer. Introduce like more computational things into their tractors. And then now there's like software updates on their tractors and stuff like that. And however, farmers who have a long history of repairing their own equipment, right, were no longer allowed by the warranty and the terms of service to actually do anything to their tractors. So they would have to go get a John Deere representative to come out to like rural Ohio and to go help them fix their tractor. But that's just not feasible, right? Because like crops don't wait for your tractor to be fixed. It could be weeks, all of the things I mentioned above. So what happened is they learned to hack their tractors and just went in and fixed stuff themselves. John Deere was not happy with this, of course, but like, you're seeing an example of when pushed to the brink, right? It's impacting their livelihood. It's impacting their ability to, take care of their crops and to do their job. People need to be able to fix the equipment if we're going to rely on this stuff. Anyway, it's been a very interesting process to follow. There's actually been some FTC rulings on it. So, how it relates to AI is one can envision a world in which we're not just beholden to the output of AI models, especially if they don't work for us. Right now, we don't have clear systems of accountability. If something goes wrong with a model, what do? You like take to social media and try to go viral? That's really not the best way to do things. And there are so many groups, like I'm certainly not the only person doing this by any means. And I wouldn't want to be the only person doing this because then it would be a really difficult mountain to climb. There are amazing groups and organizations pushing for things like protections for ethical hackers. So what I'm not saying is that every person on earth needs to know how to like hack their iPhone. What I'm saying is there should be groups and organizations that don't just work for like OpenAI and Apple, that have the ability to provide this service for people, because that leads to more market diversity. It leads to like people's preferences being met. I don't think, most tech companies have thought through the specifics of what it means to create LLMs that students are using in schools, right? Because that's just not their big business use case, but it is a really big deal, but teachers don't have any recourse. Like they're not going to learn how to program guardrails, and they all know their students are using chat GPT or whatever, but they have no way of working together or creating a solution that works for them. Anyway, so like that's sort of a vision of a right to repair for AI. But like I said, the starting point really is like doing these red teaming exercises and teaching people that you have a right to question AI systems, because most people don't feel like they do. And that's the first barrier to overcome, is people's perceptions. And then second is like giving them the avenues to exercise that right.
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is the agency that all of us have, because even if an AI product gives you an output, you can choose what you use from that or not use from that. And again, you're choosing which products you're using, how you're looking at that, the privacy settings, all of those different types of things are all somewhat of a form of that, of the choices that we're all getting to make. And to your point about making it more open, I keep thinking about when I grew up, my dad taught me how to change the oil in my car, and you can't even really do that anymore on your own. You have to take it to the dealership or to a mechanic who's more specialized in that, and you can't, just pull it into your garage and
Right.
do
Right.
that yourself.
Or like to your point, it's not that like you have to learn how to do it per se, but the fact that there is a local mechanic that is not necessarily an employee of Honda or Toyota that can go and do that. Like that does not exist in tech, right? So the ability to change an oil on a car from a mechanic that is not just a big corporation's mechanic is a freedom that we do not have in tech. So it's kind of advocating for something quite similar to, and to your point, some people will just do it themselves and you should have every right to, right? But also you should be able to go to a third party expert that is not just right the corporation that built the thing if you choose to, or you could just go to the corporation and do it. But again, back to agency and choice, we don't have choice right now in any technology. And yes, like I am such a big advocate of people taking advantage of the tools and products we have to exercise agency, but I fully recognize it's incredibly limited. And again, like one of the reasons it's limited is every company will argue, and they have the numbers to back it, is that most people don't engage with those tools. So that's step one, right? Like we can only do baby steps. And then step two is then pushing for more, right? In from my place of advocacy and privilege, I can try to push for more, but I have to be very clear on what it is that we want built.
Yeah. You've also worked in government, and you worked in Biden administration, right? In doing some work around AI. And then obviously we've seen a lot of pivots that happen anytime there's a new administration come, whether it's a party change or not. And this one has been particularly chaotic and a lot of change that's sort of happening. First, what was your experience like working in government, and what did you sort of learn from that? Because it's a very different environment than tech.
Yeah, so I was pretty familiar with kind of how the policy space works, I guess, in my early career. I worked mostly in state and local governments. I worked for a group called the Council of State Governments, and I actually really enjoyed it. Policy just works very differently. Also, added bonus, my PhD is in American politics, so I know exactly how the US government works. And it was really interesting to see tech people come to DC because those institutions are navigated quite differently. Also, I often think that people's perceptions of where power lies is actually very, very different from where power actually lies in DC. So like part of me was just like incredibly intellectually interested in like watching the game be played. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because like I've just taken too much game theory. So like I love seeing good strategy and I love seeing strategy play out. And I also like I was trained of very particular schools that like were really push the value of institutions. And it's interesting, like I am actually a full believer that if you set up the right institutional structure and incentive models, and again, too much game theory, right? The chips will fall in a very particular way, right? So if you just do the setup in a particular way, it will like fall in a way that is not highly predictable, but like, you've done your best to nudge it to be in the direction you want, right? So DC is like a fascinating place because, the US, just like wax poetic for a second, right? The US as is set up as, a very young democracy, like, well, a very young country was an experiment in democracy, right? That's the whole Alexis de Tocqueville thing, right? For people who don't know, if they're fully tech people who've never taken a political science class, Alexis de Tocqueville was a French and he came to the US to understand the American experiment because it was just so wildly different. Because you have to understand, like, there was a time in which people truly believed that, your right to rule was given by God or your blood lineage. And the absolute insane idea that like regular people who didn't own land should be able to say who was in charge, and that may change every 2 to 4 years, was absolutely wild. Because in some ways, like dynasties are very stable, right? If something passes from father to son or whatever, then you're internally consistent, even if it's awful. And frankly, often people opt for things that are consistent, even if it's awful, because it's the devil you know. So it's such a weird idea. So now we talk a lot about the US being kind of broken from a democratic perspective, but like understanding it in context of the history of how this country was built and formed, like you do have to appreciate that it was like a weirdly radical idea at the time, right? And everything about how this country was set up was just absolutely bananas to like everybody else in the world. And of course, I know that's hundreds of years ago, but that matters, right? So going to DC is super interesting because you get to see these institutions play out. And one of the most important things that I think is being challenged and broken down today's system of checks and balances. So when I first entered DC, I was really excited to work with organizations like NIST, for example, right? But everyone's like, standards body, why would you want to work with a standards body? But you have to understand how power lies in DC, how checks and balances work. And frankly, I don't know if many people in our current administration understand how the US government works, right? The
Yep.
president is not a king who can decree whatever the hell he wants and then gets it done. That is one of the most beautiful things about America, right? And that, again, back to like the founding of the country, was absolutely insane and unique. The fact that the person in charge did not have full unilateral power to do whatever the hell they wanted was something that had not really been seen before. So, like, yes, many things are broken, but also appreciate that, like, checks and balances are real, like, they are constitutionally protected. And even things like states' rights, which is such a hot button issue, and used in many ways, good or bad, was also and also still remains a very unique and interesting thing. So especially we think about the world of AI policy, right? You know, Europe has the EU AI Act, they had GDPR, and the question everybody in tech will always say, oh, why doesn't the US have something like that? I'm like, well, actually, the history of the US is that states have things usually bubble up from the state level to the federal level. It is actually more uncommon for the federal government to just pass a law on something absent any state laws that exist in it. So this is why the current administration is trying to stifle states from passing AI laws because they have no intention of doing it. But the history of the US is not that. The history of the US is that states take action, then there's sort of a collective push for the federal government to pass something. Think about privacy law, right? So GDPR led to things like CCPA. And what companies then start to worry about is like, oh my gosh, we're going to have 50 states and 50 laws. Like, that's a mess. We're going to now advocate in the federal government to say, we need a unifying law, right? But now all the senators and Congress people are actually more informed because their individual states have had those arguments and discussions. So they're going to come armed, right? And this is how it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
Not necessarily how it always works, but that's how it's supposed to work. So like one of the things that being in DC was like seeing that play out, right? And again, we get it like I think on the outside you get a very superficial view of DC, but there's so much that happens. There are so many unsung heroes. There are so many people who can't, won't, or don't go public with the work they do because they're dedicated to, you know, seeing these institutions being protected and upheld.
Last question. Looking ahead, what's a question you're obsessed with right now, but you don't have an answer to yet?
Oh, what's a question that I am obsessed with right now? I would just to get like very specific, I suppose, is what is the best way to evaluate agentic AI models in a way that's inclusive and scalable? So, you know, the next big trend in AI is AI agents. And like for people who aren't familiar with AI agents, they're like basically AI models that can go and kind of take action. And I don't want to, they're actually quite limited right now. I call them three APIs in a trench coat, which like every tech person always finds immensely hilarious. But basically that's kind of what it is. It's like a Gen AI model that you communicate some preferences to and it's able to go online and like do things. And these things are quite simple because you could say something like, you know, I want to create a daily planner for the next like year that includes everybody's birthdays and like important dates. And let's say in some theoretical world, this like planner agent is able to like connect to your calendar and connect to your email and automatically pull things in. So it's this is not what I'm not talking about is like this thing that's alive. It's really just like doing these kind of simple tasks. But even within that simple those simple tasks, it ends up being the risk space is like really broad, right? Because now you have this model that operates very quickly, interacting with other technical systems, which may or may not be other models. And the complexity of evaluation of that space gets very different from I stick some people in front of a screen and they're testing an AI model and they're giving me feedback because now they're doing something and then this AI model is going and doing other things. How do I evaluate that? So right now there's sort of two solutions that exist. One is to basically create a synthetic environment. So you imagine as like if I'm trying to create a shopping agent, I create an environment, a closed environment that looks like an Amazon website and you sort of throw your agent out there and sort of see how it does and if it does things it's not supposed to do whatever. The other version, and so the problem with that is it's incredibly expensive to build. It's really difficult to scale and it's hard to generalize. So if again back to like my education example, most of the examples that exist of let's say open source or accessible agentic AI testing won't serve the needs of an educator trying to understand if like an AI education agent is going to do its job well, right, for kids. So then how does somebody help them? And then the problem will just exist, like hyper specific problems, right? And the other version is like, it's actually quite old school, where you make an AI agent that is verbose, as in it's like constantly giving feedback on what it's doing. And then you have a method, usually another AI model, that's real time, like evaluating every action and ensuring that it's aligned with the preferences you've given. And if it deviates, it's like, stop. But like, that sounds incredibly old school. And in some ways, it really is. So that's kind of the big thing I'm thinking about. And maybe just to like make the question quite meta, it's like, as these models increase in complexity, how do we simultaneously align with hyper localized preferences, right? Because these models are getting more
Yeah.
and more general, more and more big, but actually our preferences are very individualized. So how do you like balance that, like high and low?
So, where can people follow along with your work? Where's the best place to do that?
Well, our website, humane-intelligence.org, is a great place to do it. I have just not been on social media for a while lately. So I guess LinkedIn is probably the best way to find me. Or my website. It's just my name, RummanChowdhury.com. And then you can just reach out.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it, Katie. Thanks.
That's it for this week's conversation. I'm still thinking about something Ramon said about how optimism isn't a lack of understanding, it's the result of fully understanding the risks and still deciding to build. It's easy to feel powerless right now, but I hope that if there's one thing that you take away from this episode, it's that we all have tools. They might be small. It might be reaching for that privacy setting. It might be clicking reject all cookies. It could be pushing for more accountability where we work. But those actions are signals, and signals shape systems. We also talked about failure, how it's not just inevitable, but necessary, and about how the people working inside these institutions, quietly doing the hard work, are just as much a part of the story as the loudest voices. If you're feeling stuck or overwhelmed, maybe ask yourself, what's one small act of agency you can take this week? What would it look like to stop waiting for permission to shape the future? If you want more conversations like this, along with my takes on tech, politics, and how we navigate the world, we dive deeper every week in my newsletter. You can subscribe at anchorchange.substack.com. Thank you so much for listening. If this episode sparked something for you, I'd love it if you shared it or left a review. Until next time, panic responsibly.